Welcome back, everybody. Would you like to take your seats? So I'm Helen Joyce. I'm the Economist's international editor, and I'm going to be chairing some of the sessions today along with my colleagues Zanny and Dan, whom I think you've already met. Before we start our next session, we have another polling question, and I think you've already got used to using the app. So that's what we're going to do again. This is our third polling question of the day, and the results will be displayed after the end of this session. And our question is, do you think the rise of populism in the West will curb progress on LGBT rights? Yes or no? So we'll be returning to that at the end and hearing your answers and also the answers from social media. Right, on with the day. We're starting with a video conference with Johannes Hahn, who is the European Commissioner for Neighbourhood Policy and Enlargement. Johannes, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Wonderful.
Prejudice London.
Okay, I think implicit in the fact that we've asked you to come and talk to us today, Johannes, is the idea that the EU has been a force for progressive values, not only inside the EU, but in its region and as countries seek to join. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, Helen and colleagues, friends, first of all, I would like to express my condolences to London and to everybody there on the events of yesterday. Because it's another proof that we have to stand firm to our values, to our convictions, to our open society. And this is what guides us also in our discussions and negotiations with our friends in the Eastern neighborhood, in the Western Balkan, when it comes to enlargement.
Thank you. Okay. With that thought, let's turn to the topic of our session today, which is about what you, in your role dealing with neighbours and in also people seeking to join the EU, do and see in terms of progressive values and LGBT rights?
Well, negotiating with our friends, for instance, in the Western Balkan, when it comes to enlargement, I prefer to speak about the process, because it's not only about negotiations, it's about, so to say, taking over our values, our convictions, our understanding, our cultural behavior. But embedded in this, our discussions with them, our negotiations are, so to say, structured into altogether 35 chapters. And there are two chapters, 23 and 24, which deal with fundamentals, in particular 23. And we start all our negotiations with our friends by opening these chapters at the beginning and closing exactly these chapters at the end of this process, in order to see if there's real a sustainable development, a sustainable change, may I say also of cultural behavior, because we can only make progress, these countries can only align with the European Union if they also align with our societal understanding of an open, transparent society. And by the way, I believe that this kind of society is the best guarantee also for a very open, investor-friendly climate, which is conducive to attract foreign investors to these countries, in order also to improve their economic performance, which is equally important for their future membership.
I guess by now, enough countries have joined the EU after it was founded that countries that now seek to join have some idea how this process is going to go. So it's not a surprise for them that there is this process. Do you find that they are ready for it, that they've already started to take action themselves before even entering the process?
Well, exactly on this, it's something where you cannot dictate something or you cannot impose. This has to be done on their own. But supporting this is also due to the fact that we support, for instance, civil society organizations, also LGBTI organizations, in order to support this process, to assist them in all their efforts. And that's why, once again, we are talking about the process. We cannot say and predict there is a deadline or there is an end date when it happens. This has to be done on their own, but we are doing everything to support all these efforts.
And these sorts of civil society organisations and activists, is joining or starting the process to join the EU something that they ardently wish for in order to get an outside help in promoting their values?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, in all these countries, cooperation with civil society organizations from the different parts of society is crucial to have these societal changes, to have this development. And of course, one of them are the aforementioned organizations, and we count on them because it's in their interest, it's in our interest, and close cooperation is needed and is very welcome.
So we've been hearing earlier today about generational shift, that this sort of way of thinking is very natural to millennials and maybe less so to older people. Do you find that in the accession countries or in countries that are thinking about trying to join, it's mostly younger people who you're engaging with?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, also, when I'm there, I usually meet representatives from civil society organizations, and in particular, in this group, it's not only young people. Fortunately, also elderly ones are, so to say, ready to represent their interests. But of course, most of the cases, these are younger people. And by the way, if I'm in this region and using also the opportunity to walk a little bit around and to be in the center of, let's say, capitals and big towns, you can see already the progress in this societal change, and this is a very colorful picture. And I really enjoy the developments you can really see.
Are there any particular aspects of the progressive agenda we're discussing today that you see as a common sticking point for countries? Any specific or particular examples you can give me of things that end up being difficult for countries to adopt?
No, nothing particular. But as I said already, for obvious reasons, we start this process by opening chapters where the rights of LGBTI people are, so to say, discussed and negotiated at the beginning, being fully aware about, so to say, the time it takes to have this change. And for instance, in Serbia, we applied just this procedure. And if I look at the situation, for instance, in Belgrade, one can see already certain progress. Of course, we are not yet there where we would like to be, but again, it's the beginning of something, and it is not something where you can say that's the beginning and this is the end. It's work in progress, but there is progress, definitely.
And do you see any shift in thinking from our neighbours outside the EU now that it looks less likely that there's going to be any sort of speedy enlargement? I mean, we're turning, as the Economist's cover said some months ago, from a drawbridge down to a drawbridge up world. People within the EU, large minorities in a lot of countries, are rather keen on actually leaving or on not having any further accession. Is this changing the dynamic with our neighbours and with our potential future members?
Well, from the perspective of our candidate countries, if you like, nothing has changed. The attractiveness of Europe is still huge, and I regret that apparently often Europeans or citizens from the European Union are less self-confident about what has been achieved in Europe, and apparently others from outside appreciate much more, so to say, the way we are living, how we are working together. So the attractiveness of Europe has not suffered. Number one. Number two, when it comes to the future development of all these countries and the acceptance by our citizens to have them in future as a member, this is only possible if the economic situation in these countries has improved. And this leads me to what I have said previously. We can only improve the economy, we can only attract foreign investors if the whole climate, the whole setting in these countries is transparent, is open, is inviting everybody, so that everybody can really pursue his or her own interests. And so therefore, having this kind of necessary societal changes also helps us in improving the performance of the economy in order to be at the future moment accepted by European citizens. So we regret the decision of British people, but on the other hand, we see a lot of interest by others. And in between, we have our European citizens, which partly have to be convinced. But I can only say we have only the option to export stability or to import instability. And this is what guides us in our negotiations, discussions, and cooperation with our candidate countries.
Thank you so much, Johannes, for making the time to join us, and thank you for your condolences as well.
Thank you, and greetings to London and all the friends.
Okay. I have a question for everybody before we leave, if Johannes could just stay on the line. Could I have a show of hands? Who thinks of the EU as part of the progressive force that helps to guarantee their rights here in Britain? And who hasn't really either thought of it or thinks that this is not relevant and, for example, Britain may be fine without being in the EU on this matter? Okay, Johannes, you'll be glad to know there were, I think, 2 or maybe 3 brave hands went up to the second one, and you got quite a forest of them the first time round. Thank you very much again. Let's just... So I'd like to invite my 2 panelists up here with me as well. I have John Mills, who is the founder of JML Group, who's going to sit here beside me, and Liz Barker, a Liberal Democrat peer from the House of Lords. So, John, you're Mr. Brexit on this panel.
Yeah.
So I think you might have been one of the hands that went up there, were you? You don't think that Brexit is going to cause us difficulties on this agenda?
I think it's going to make very little difference. I think that the way that social policies developed in this country is so entrenched that the idea that it's going to be rolled back, I mean, I think actually Britain is well ahead of most of the rest of Europe in terms of what's been done to reinforce rights in the workplace and elsewhere. And I think that it's very, very unlikely you're going to see any retrogression. I don't think any of the political parties are going to be anywhere near that.
What about you, Liz? What do you think?
I think amongst the very many half-truths and that were bandied about during the campaign, the idea that the EU had played very little or no part in our gaining rights in this country was perhaps one of the most egregious. Because while it is certainly true that in terms of things like decriminalisation 50 years ago or same-sex marriage, that was the political will in this country, I think that during the course of that 50 years, many of the advances that we have made towards equality, it's, for example, stuff like the goods and services regulations and all of that, are absolutely traceable back to the EU and the EU institutions.
I think, John, that, you can hear my accent, you can hear I'm Irish, and a lot of people who talked about Brexit said, for example, that Ireland and Britain had a close partnership before the EU, and that therefore leaving shouldn't make any difference. Yet the last 40 years we've evolved together within the EU because that's where we were. So I totally take your point that Britain was changing already. We decriminalised these same-sex relations before the EU. That's not where it came from. But the last 40 years have been within the EU. Does it not worry you a bit that we'll sort of let some balls drop even, at least, in the move, in the change of legal framework?
I mean, I don't really see why it should at all. I mean, actually, going back to your point, there's about 6 different categories of social and employment legislation which this country has adopted, and I think 5 of them were all initiated in this country. I think only one, I think that was the one to do with paternity leave, actually originated in the EU. Now, it is true that there's been a certain amount of gold plating, which I think is welcome as a result of our EU membership. But the idea that the drawbridge is going to be drawn up, we're all going to retrograde back to some sort of situation like we had 30 or 40 years ago, I think is completely unreal. I think actually Britain has been well ahead of other countries in Europe.
Well, then can I turn that around? Do you not think that we're maybe taking some very progressive force out of the EU, that there are other countries that could have done with our voice there still?
Well, I think there is an element of truth in that, to be honest with you. I mean, if you look around the EU, I think I'm right in saying that only 12 of the 28 countries recognise equal marriages. I think only 6 or 7 recognise civil partnerships. I mean, there's a long, long way to go in the EU to catch up with the sort of situation that we have in this country. So, I mean, I hope very much that if we're outside the EU, that we will be able to keep the pressure up and move Europe as far as we possibly can in the direction we've gone. But
Liz,
we're ahead, we're not behind.
as an activist, I'm guessing, Liz, that you work with people in other countries as well. Are we going to be able to keep those ties going, and can you see ways in which Britain can keep being a progressive voice in Europe?
I don't see any reason why we can't. I mean, it just seems to me that there's an enormous amount of common interest we have with all the countries in Europe, and we ought to maintain and enhance them. I mean, I think there were significant difficulties about the terms of membership we had, which is why I was in favour of Brexit. But this doesn't mean you can't cooperate on a vast range of things, including the sort of pressures that need to be applied to get social and employment legislation kept in place and advanced.
How can we make that work, Liz?
We can, because we are the nation that we are. We're entrepreneurial and we're skillful, and we've got a history of maintaining good relationships around the world. But it is undoubtedly the case that having walked out, as we have done, we really have damaged our relationships with people in other countries. They are activists in countries around the EU who are still having a very, very tough time. Really do see it as an abandonment on our part. They're quite worried that we've set a bad example to those forces within their own country who don't want to be leading the progressive way that we do.
I mean, to be fair, I very much doubt anyone voted for Brexit either way, with this issue to the forefront of their minds. I think there were probably as many reasons to vote as there were voters, but that this wouldn't have been really a major one. So can we not, quite plausibly say we're still part of this progressive community within Europe? I say this as a Remainer, so you can take my...
I mean, I think if you say, why did people vote the way they did in the Brexit referendum? A huge amount depended on how well they'd done economically over the last few years, how well they'd done out of globalisation and liberalisation of trade and all the rest of it. And I think one of the problems is that the relatively ineffective economic policies that have been pursued in Europe and the relatively slow rates of economic growth, slow recovery from the 2008 crash, means that the sort of consensus between the people who advance these sort of causes and those who've got to be pulled along has broken down to a fair extent. And I think that's a real problem right across Europe.
I want to ask you both about two very specific issues that I think we'll have to decide what we're going to do about. One of those is the specific issue of protection, equal rights, for example, Christian employers who want to be able to discriminate and can't, and at the moment that's EU legislation that stops them. And the other one is about refugees, LGBT refugees, because again, it's the EU framework that that guides us and how we deal with these claims. Liz, are these two issues that are salient for you?
Absolutely, and I'm pretty...
Have I picked the right two?
Yeah. I think you have. I have to say, of all the people that I have heard arguing vociferously and actively for a British Bill of Rights as opposed and repealing the Human Rights Act, I've never yet seen one of them legging it to a pride march to display their credentials on equality. And I am very, very fearful that we are going to open up a space in which we will row back, will no longer be given the protection of the European Charter, for example. So I think we're going to be in a very, very vulnerable position. And if we do, we're not going to have the recourse to the courts that we have had in the past, which has been a very key way in which we have determined these matters and upheld our rights.
I'm ashamed to say I don't actually know, has there been polling on matters such as whether prejudice against LGBT people should count as a reason for refugee status, or the other one that I said, this issue of discrimination by, say, Christian employers or whatever. Do you know of polling? Do you know whether these are things that will be quite popular to keep those sorts of protections in British law?
There has been some polling around. I would say that the evidence is as yet unclear. I think you're right when you said that this wasn't a key factor in the way that people voted. But then at the same time, I don't think for one moment people who voted for Brexit really understand the implications of this for our community. I was talking to a young guy the other day. He's HIV positive. His career, working for an international consultancy, is now looking a lot different and very, very much worse than it was on June the 22nd last year. His life options are going to be really curtailed because of our agreements on health, for example.
I suppose the positive point I was trying to make is that there's an open door, or there's space, that if people can stay organised, It's not like there's, this is exactly why people voted to leave and therefore they're ready to counter any organisation that activists want to do. John, do you feel that there's a sort of ready organised movement to replace these rights in British law?
Well, I think there definitely is. I mean, there's a proposal to have the Great Repeal Bill, which actually is not so much a repeal, it's a reinforcement of what's already there, and to keep everything in place until Parliament may, on a democratic basis, decide to do something different. But I don't think there's any feeling anywhere that what needs to be done is to roll back social and employment legislation. I think this applies right across the political spectrum. It's not a party political point. I think the Conservatives are just as well aware as the Labour Party and others are that this is not what British people want.
We do occasionally hear, well, if you don't give us what we want, we're going to turn ourselves into Singapore-on-Thames. Singapore isn't well known as a highlight for LGBT people.
No, I don't think it is. But I mean, I think there's some elements of what has been done in Singapore which we could copy here, but we certainly don't need to copy all of it.
I do think the fact that the first thing that the British government did was to open up an office in North Carolina for UKTI, when every other business that had any principle whatsoever was getting out of there, is a really worrying trend.
I'm going to remind you all that you can submit questions through the app if you want, but also any hands. Anyone else want to make a specific point or ask either of our panellists a question about how Brexit is going to affect the progressive agenda? Over there. Okay, I think we have a hand up over here, have we? There's a gentleman here with a hand up as well. Yeah, okay, yeah.
Mark Emden from Workplace Pride. We're an Amsterdam-based organisation. So I'd actually like to move the conversation a bit towards populism, which you have in the title.
That was my next move, by the way.
Rather good, rather than just Brexit. And then also link it back to the role of organisations being that catalyst for change in a world where we're seeing growth in populism. And a question around, what do you see is either the role or the moral requirement of organisations to, or do you see them required to do, or the stance to take as we see a growth in populism? Because we see some companies being far more visible than others. So just interested to get a sense of views on that particular topic.
Well, John, I'll turn to you first.
Well, I mean, I think on the whole, the growth of populism is a very negative factor in all this. And I think what's happened is that there's been a breakdown in trust between the kind of Westminster bubble, the sort of people who are at the conference here today, and vast numbers of working people all over the country who are now dissatisfied with the way things have gone over the last 10 years. They haven't had wage increases. They've found more and more pressure on jobs. The job situation for them generally is weakened. There's more self-employment, which is actually very low paid and insecure.
So do you see the populist sort of as a sort of a false answer to these sorts of worries?
Yeah, well, I think once you start getting a breakdown between the element of trust between the kind of ruling elite and other people, then you tend to get a retrogression back towards less tolerant attitudes to LGBT and all these other issues. And I think that's a really sad thing to see happening.
Do you see that too, Liz?
Yeah, I do. But to answer your question, I think the absolutely key and fundamental role of business is to make the economic case. We all know, and those of us in the voluntary sector who go out and march very passionately and all that, know that discrimination costs. It costs at an individual level, it costs at a company level, and we know that it costs on a national level. And I remember sitting in this room a year ago, listening to Vivienne Meng, reading subsequently her FT articles about how it's possible to plot the cost of discrimination across an economy. And, you count, you really do, you count the things that matter. And if you can do anything else for us, it is to give us, those of us who are in politics or in civil society, that ammunition which will counteract populism. And quite a lot of populism fundamentally is not based on rational judgment or indeed evidence. So please help us with that.
I think it's very interesting what you say, because we've been talking for the last several months about things like post-truth politics and fake news and so on, and you can sometimes feel that facts are irrelevant. You wish they weren't, but they feel irrelevant, but they're really not. I mean, really what we have to do is just keep, calmly and politely and engaging, like you say, trying to break down this barrier that people feel between the bubble and everyone else, and try and talk across it in a helpful and respectful way.
Yes, I think all that's true. And I think we should keep on trying as hard as we can. I mean, I just think we're facing a bit of an uphill struggle if the economy goes on not exactly flatlining, but growing very slowly. On the whole, the benefits of the economy that have been growing have gone to people who've been rich already, leaving large swathes of the population no better off. These are the things that feed populism, and populism then, I think, feeds discrimination. So that's what we want to avoid.
Sure. I've got a question from the app, but I'm going to take the question here first. Yeah, fine, we've got our mic there, yeah.
Yeah, hi, Rona Abijan. Since, well, the day after Brexit, a group of men were recorded singing a rather charming song, Rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves. First we'll kick the Poles out, then we'll get the gays. That made its way around social media quite quickly. In the 3 months following Brexit, there was an increase of homophobic hate crime of 147%. The increase of LGBT people accessing mental health services has also gone up by over 200% since Brexit. It's all very well saying that our rights will be protected, but it's not just about our rights. It is the people who, not by no means all the people who voted Brexit, I'm not going to claim they all are, but the minority of people who voted Brexit, because they are bigoted, now feel that they have free license to be bigoted because enough of the country agreed with them. It's not just about our rights in law, it's about our protection in the community. Many LGBT people cannot access police services. It's not safe for us to do so. We don't feel safe outing ourselves to the courts, to the police, and to everybody else. Because we've been the victim of a crime. How would you address that post-Brexit?
What can we do to...
Well, I think you need to be very careful to get all this in proportion. There was an increase in hate crime, but it was a very small increase on a very, very small number. And I really don't think you advance the argument by exaggerating what happened.
I don't think she exaggerated. I mean, I think the figures were, there. I totally take your point. This is a safe country. This started off being a pretty safe country by international standards, for sure. But I mean, that doesn't mean that we say, oh, well, it's gone up a bit, but it started very low. It's best to take these things very seriously when they start, don't you think?
I completely agree. And 99.999% of the people who voted for Brexit don't support any of all this that goes on. I mean, just to produce percentages which start from a very tiny figure and then go up, I really think you just need a sense of proportion about what's happening here.
But what can we do? I mean, what are the active steps that businesses and politicians, let's start with Liz, politicians in particular?
Number one, I think be visible in be visible and vocal in your support for minorities, and expect of your politicians that they be visible and vocal in respect of fairness and equality and justice. And I think call out some of the other civic players. I'm very interested in what our religious leaders are doing these days, because they have an enormous influence, not just in the boardrooms and all of that, but right down at community level. And I think that we need to be, the time when people could be a bit wishy-washy about our rights, sit on the fence, that's gone. They need to be challenged and brought up to the plate.
I think it's so true that most people are not bigots, whatever they voted. It's about, for me, it's about holding a line and doing that in a proactive way, like not saying, well, it's not that much or it's not that bad. That is true, but we've seen where this can go, and we were there very recently ourselves. Do you feel there's a responsibility for businesses to maybe double or redouble their efforts to be friendly, be open, be...
Yes, I do. I mean, I think that everybody's got to make an effort to try and move these progressive causes forward. I certainly do this. What I would say, though, is that the reason why they're slipping back in some respect, I think, has got very little to do with Brexit as such. It's got a lot more to do with people feeling alienated because they don't feel that society is really looking after them properly. And I think that binding the country back together again is a really very, very important part of the whole LGBT agenda. If you're going to see a big gap opening up between the sort of bien pensant metropolitan people and those who live out in other parts of the country, that's not going to help LGBT causes forward at all.
A key part of the Leave campaign was this suggestion that we would be able to develop new relationships around the world that had somehow been held back because of our relationship with the EU. Well, fair enough. But if equality is not at the heart of those relationships, then they are worthless. We can't develop a new set of business relationships with the Commonwealth very easily when we are discriminated against in the majority of them and criminalised in many. So business is going to have a really big job in fomenting those new relationships that was spoken about, I have to say, with a very minimal detail.
I do see that as a silver lining, though.
Yeah.
I do. I mean, I do, generally speaking, see Britain as a progressive force in the world, and it is quite good that, you know, maybe we'll have to talk to some people who might be harder to talk to than we have previously thought.
I must say, if you're going to start putting LGBT issues right at the very front of trade negotiations, unfortunately, I really don't think you're going to get anywhere, because most of the rest of the world is nowhere near as advanced as we are.
I'm going to hold that thought because there's a session on exactly that later. I want to go to my poll results, but I also want to tell you I wasn't ignoring the question that came in the app. It was actually just the same as the one that I had just taken. So please do keep sending your questions on the app. So we have poll results. Okay. So exactly the same results from social media and from the audience. We had 60% yes. Let me remind myself of what the question was. Completely forgotten. We had, sorry, it's on the screen. It's not on my screen. It's not on my screen. I just have the answers. I'm going to read. Oh, do you think the rise of populism in the West will curb progress on LGBT rights? I have a different screen than you. I've got less on it, I promise. So yes, 60% yes, 40% no, and that's both on social media and in the audience. Okay, I'm going to just give you both. You can see the countdown. You've got like 18 seconds each if you want to just make one final point. John.
Well, what I would say is I think LGBT rights are incredibly important. I think Britain has done well compared to most other countries in this regard. I think we are something of a beacon of progress. I hope very much that we will be able to extend that not only to other countries in Europe, but also, if these trade negotiations do go well, to the wider world.
Good, thank you. And Liz?
We've got to carry the advantage that we have gained from membership of the EU over all these years and take it forward to new parts of the world that we've never talked about before.
Write that down, would you? I think it's really good. You can get it on a T-shirt. Thank you so much to both my panellists. I have to stay here.